Imagine looking at a radar scope on a cold January night. You are an Iraqi air defense commander sitting in a concrete bunker beneath Baghdad. Your airspace is protected by the most dense, overlapping and sophisticated anti-aircraft grid outside of Moscow. You have thousands of surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery pieces wired into a centralized command and control network. Your radar screens show absolutely nothing. The sky is empty. Then the telecommunications building in the center of your capital explodes. The power grid goes dark. The command centers are vaporized. You never saw what hit you. You never heard it coming. That was the reality on the opening night of Operation Desert Storm. Welcome back to the channel, where we dissect the hardware, the tactics, and the brutal realities of modern warfare. If you want to understand how the United States military went from grinding, bloody attrition to surgical, invisible strikes, you are in the right place. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let me know down in the comments what classified black project you want us to declassify next. Now, let us get into the shadows. To understand why the United States poured billions of black-budget dollars into an airplane that looked like a flying doorstop, we have to rewind the clock. We have to go back to October 1973, the Yom Kippur War. The Israeli Air Force, flying top-of-the-line American hardware like the F-4 Phantom and the A-4 Skyhawk, ran headfirst into a meat grinder. The Egyptians and Syrians deployed a dense umbrella of Soviet-built surface-to-air missiles, specifically the highly mobile SA-6 Gainful, backed by ZSU-23-4 Shilka anti-aircraft guns. In the first 3 days of that conflict, the Israelis lost 50 combat aircraft. Let that sink in. 50 planes in 72 hours. It was a slaughter in the sky. For American military planners watching from the Pentagon, it was a terrifying wake-up call. It was a direct flashback to the bloody skies over Europe in 1943. Back then, the 8th Air Force tried unescorted daylight precision bombing against German ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, and they lost 60 B-17 flying fortresses in a single afternoon. The lesson then was that bombers needed fighter escorts. The lesson in 1973 was much worse. If the best pilots in the Middle East were getting swatted out of the sky by Soviet missiles, what would happen to American pilots flying over the Fulda Gap in West Germany? The answer was grim. War games predicted that in a conventional World War III scenario against the Warsaw Pact, the United States Air Force would lose its entire tactical fighter fleet in less than 2 weeks. The Soviet Integrated Air Defense System, or IADS, was simply too thick. You could not fly over it, you could not fly under it, and trying to jam it with electronic warfare was becoming a losing game of cat and mouse. The traditional American doctrine was brute force. We called it the strike package. To drop a couple of 2,000-pound bombs on a bridge, you needed a massive armada. You needed F-4G Wild Weasels to hunt the radars. You needed F-111 Ravens to jam the frequencies. You needed F-15 Eagles to fight off enemy MiGs. You needed a fleet of KC-135 Stratotankers to fuel the whole circus. A 40-plane package risking dozens of American lives just to put one bomb on one target. It was tactically bloated and logistically unsustainable. The industrial capacity required to replace those projected losses simply did not exist in a post-Vietnam America. Something had to change. We needed a silver bullet. The solution did not come from a wind tunnel. It came from a math equation, and ironically, it came from the Soviet Union. In 1964, a Russian mathematician named Pyotr Ufimtsev published a heavily theoretical paper titled Method of edge waves in the physical theory of diffraction. The Soviet military establishment ignored it, thinking it had no practical application. They let it be translated and published internationally. That was a multi-trillion-dollar mistake. Over at Lockheed's Advanced Development Programs, better known as the Skunk Works in Burbank, California, a radar specialist named Dennis Overholser stumbled upon this translated paper. He realized that Ufimtsev had cracked the code to calculating the radar cross-section of a flat two-dimensional shape. Radar is essentially a flashlight in a dark room. The radar dish sends out electromagnetic waves. When those waves hit a target, they bounce back to the receiver, telling the operator where the object is, how fast it is moving, and how big it is. If you could design an aircraft with perfectly flat surfaces, angled in a very specific way, you could deflect those radar waves away from the receiver. Like holding a mirror at an angle to bounce a flashlight beam into the dirt rather than back at the person holding the light. Overholser and mathematician Bill Schroeder wrote a computer program called Echo 1. They fed it the mathematical formulas, and the computer spit out a design for an aircraft that looked absolutely ridiculous. It was a diamond shape with flat, faceted panels. Aerodynamically, it was a disaster. Ben Rich, the legendary head of Skunk Works, called it the hopeless diamond. But when they built a wooden model and put it on a pole at a radar cross-section testing facility, the results were mind-blowing. A typical F-15 Eagle has a radar cross-section of about 25 square meters. It lights up on a radar screen like a flying barn. This new faceted design had a radar cross-section of 1/1000th of a square meter. That is the size of a steel marble. The physics worked. Let us look at the industrial and doctrinal clash happening in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The Soviet defense industry was churning out thousands of radar systems. They were building the SA-10 Grumble, a terrifyingly capable long-range missile system. They were layering their defenses. Early warning radars, acquisition radars, target tracking radars, and missile guidance radars, all operating on different frequencies. It was a wall of electromagnetic energy designed to shred NATO air power. To penetrate this, the United States decided to build the hopeless diamond. The prototype program was called Have Blue. It proved that a faceted aircraft could actually fly, thanks entirely to the brand new technology of fly-by-wire flight control computers. The plane was inherently unstable. If the computers failed, the aircraft would tumble out of the sky in a fraction of a second. But Have Blue worked. And from Have Blue came the Senior Trend program, which birthed the F-117A Nighthawk. How do you turn a physics experiment into a deadly operational weapon of war, while keeping the entire project completely hidden from Soviet spy satellites? You throw out the traditional rulebook and you operate in the absolute black. The F-117 was not built on a standard assembly line. It was hand-built in secret hangars. To save time and money, Lockheed scavenged parts from other aircraft. The flight controls came from the F-16. The engines were non-afterburning General Electric F-404 turbofans, similar to those used on the F/A-18 Hornet. The navigation system came from the B-52 bomber, but the exterior was pure alien technology. Every single inch of the Nighthawk was designed to defeat detection. The flat panels scattered radar energy. The entire airframe was coated in radar-absorbent material, or RAM. This material was toxic, heavy, and required constant agonizing maintenance. It was essentially a specialized paint mixed with iron ball particles that absorbed radar energy and converted it into heat. The application tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch. A single loose screw or a poorly taped panel gap could bloom on an enemy radar screen and get the pilot killed. But radar was not the only threat. Heat-seeking missiles could track the exhaust of a jet engine, so the F-117 used a unique platypus tail exhaust system. The hot exhaust gases from the engines were mixed with cool bypass air and squeezed out over a wide, flat titanium shelf covered in heat-resistant tiles. This dramatically reduced the infrared signature. From the ground, looking up with thermal optics, the F-117 was practically invisible. It had no afterburners. It was strictly subsonic. It could barely break 600 miles per hour. It pulled a maximum of 5 Gs. It carried no radar of its own, because emitting a radar beam is like turning on a flashlight in a dark forest. It gives away your position immediately. In many ways, the F-117 was less like a traditional fighter jet and more like a World War II Gato-class submarine prowling the Pacific. The submarine survives by staying submerged, running silent, and remaining undetected until it launches its torpedoes. The Nighthawk survived by staying in the electromagnetic shadows, flying strictly at night, and relying on absolute stealth to reach its target. If it was seen, it was dead. It had no guns to fight its way out, and it was too slow to run away. Operating this machine required a completely new breed of pilot and a bizarre logistical footprint. The Air Force established the 4,451st Tactical Group, operating out of the Tonopah Test Range in the desolate Nevada desert. Tonopah was 140 miles northwest of Las Vegas. It was a bleak, freezing, isolated patch of dirt. For years throughout the 1980s, the pilots and maintainers lived a vampire existence. They would fly out of Nellis Air Force Base on Monday afternoons in a chartered airliner, land at Tonopah, and immediately go to sleep in blackout rooms. They would wake up at sunset, eat breakfast in the dark, and brief their missions. The hangar doors only opened after the sun went down. They flew their training sorties in the pitch black of the Nevada night. They had to be back on the ground and the planes locked away in their hangars before the sun came up, just in case a Soviet Cosmos spy satellite passed overhead. Flying the F-117 was physically and mentally exhausting. The cockpit was cramped, the visibility out of the faceted canopy was terrible. Because they had no radar, the pilots navigated using inertial navigation systems and a highly classified infrared targeting system. They had to fly precise, pre-planned routes. A deviation of just a few miles could expose the wrong angle of the aircraft to an enemy radar site. It was an exercise in absolute, unforgiving precision. The environment outside was hostile. In the winter, the temperature on the Tonopah flight line would drop below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Maintainers wore heavy parkas, struggling to apply the toxic radar-absorbent putty to the aircraft panels with freezing fingers. It was a brutal, grinding routine, completely isolated from the rest of the Air Force, demanding absolute perfection from every man on the flight line. By 1989, the secret was partially out. The Air Force released a grainy, distorted photograph of the F-117 to the public, but nobody outside of the black world truly understood what the aircraft was capable of. The Soviets scoffed at it. Traditional fighter pilots mocked it, calling it the wobbly goblin. They did not believe a subsonic, unarmed, unmaneuverable bomber could survive in a modern threat environment. The theories of Pyotr Ufimtsev, the engineering genius of the Skunk works, and the grueling night training of the Tonopah vampires were about to be put to the ultimate test. A dictator in the Middle East was massing his armored divisions on the border of a tiny, oil-rich neighbor. The world was hurtling toward the largest conventional clash of armor and air power since the Second World War, and the United States military was preparing to unleash a technological revolution that would instantly render every air defense network on the planet obsolete. When Saddam Hussein sent his Republican Guard armored divisions crashing into Kuwait in August of 1990, he triggered a massive American military buildup in the Persian Gulf. The United States Air Force knew exactly what it was facing. The Iraqi military possessed the fourth largest army in the world, and their airspace was protected by a deeply layered, highly sophisticated air defense network. To strike the strategic heart of the Iraqi regime, American planners needed a weapon that could bypass this defensive wall entirely. The F-117 Nighthawk was pulled from the shadows and thrust onto the front line. But a stealth aircraft is only as lethal as the weapons it carries, and the Nighthawk was built around a very specific, highly specialized payload. The aircraft featured two internal weapon bays. External pylons were strictly forbidden, as hanging bombs on the wings would create radar reflections and instantly ruin the stealth profile. Because of this internal restriction, the F-117 could only carry 2 bombs. Just 2. To a traditional military mind, dedicating an $80 million aircraft to deliver a mere 2 bombs seemed absurd. How do you dismantle a heavily fortified, deeply dug-in command network without sending massive, vulnerable bomber formations to carpet bomb the area? You do it by changing the fundamental geometry of destruction. It was no longer about dropping tonnage on a grid square. It was about putting a single 2,000-pound piece of ordnance through a specific air conditioning vent on the roof of a command bunker. The weapon of choice was the GBU-27 Paveway 3. This was not a standard gravity bomb. It was a precision instrument, custom-built for the F-117. It featured a BLU-109 penetrating warhead, utilizing a 1-inch thick forged steel casing designed to punch through several feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. The guidance package was laser-directed, but how does a pilot, flying completely blind to radar, find a specific building in a blacked-out city? The F-117 utilized the Infrared Acquisition and Designation System, or IRADS. It consisted of 2 thermal imaging turrets. A forward-looking infrared, or FLIR, was mounted in a recess ahead of the cockpit, and a downward-looking infrared, or DLIR, was housed underneath the fuselage. As the Nighthawk approached the target at over 500 miles per hour, the pilot would locate the building on a glowing green cathode ray tube screen using the FLIR. He would manually lock the crosshairs onto the desired point of impact. As the aircraft flew over the target, the system automatically handed the tracking over to the DLIR, keeping the laser spot painted directly on the objective while the bomb glided down the beam. This level of surgical precision represented a paradigm shift in the economy of force. We can look back at the Vietnam War to understand the magnitude of this leap. In 1965, the United States military identified the Tan Hoa Bridge in North Vietnam as a critical logistical choke point. Over the next 7 years, the Air Force and Navy flew 873 sorties against that single bridge. They dropped thousands of tons of unguided bombs. They lost 11 aircraft and their crews to heavy anti-aircraft fire. and the bridge stood until 1972, when early laser-guided bombs finally brought it down. The F-117 eliminated the need for those 800 sorties. One Nighthawk, carrying 2 laser-guided bombs, could do the job of an entire Vietnam-era strike package, completely undetected, with 0 friendly casualties. However, this incredible capability came with a fatal tactical vulnerability. To drop the bomb, the F-117 had to open its weapon bay doors. For those few terrifying seconds, the perfectly calculated faceted geometry of the aircraft was ruined. The flat belly of the jet suddenly featured a gaping, jagged cavity. In that brief window, the radar cross-section spiked massively. The aircraft could suddenly be seen by enemy radar. The pilots trained obsessively to minimize this exposure. They had to open the doors, release the weapon, and slam the doors shut in under 5 seconds. A jammed door meant instant death in a high-threat environment. Deploying this fragile, high-maintenance machine to the Middle East was a logistical nightmare. In August 1990, the 415th Tactical Fighter Squadron deployed to King Khalid Air Base in the extreme southwest of Saudi Arabia. The environment was the absolute worst enemy of stealth technology. The temperature on the tarmac routinely exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The fine, powdery desert sand blew into every crevice of the aircraft. Remember, the F-117 relied on a highly sensitive, toxic radar-absorbent putty to seal the panel gaps and screw heads. In the blistering Saudi heat, this putty would blister, crack, and peel. Maintainers had to work around the clock, often in full, heavy chemical protective gear due to the threat of Iraqi Scud missiles, scraping and reapplying the toxic material to keep the fleet invisible. The logistical supply chain stretched 7,000 miles back to the United States, requiring a constant airlift of specialized chemicals, clean room equipment, and replacement parts. Could this temperamental, highly sensitive black project actually function in the harshest, most chaotic combat environment on Earth? The answer came on the night of January 17, 1991. The objective was Baghdad. The Iraqi capital was defended by a French-designed computerized air defense network known as KARI. It was a highly redundant fiber-optic linked system that integrated over 500 early warning and tracking radars. These radars fed real-time data to sector operations centers, which in turn controlled thousands of surface-to-air missile launchers. They possessed the SA-2 guideline for high-altitude threats, the SA-3 GOA for medium altitude, and highly mobile SA-6 and SA-8 systems for low-level interceptions. Backing up the missiles were over 3,000 anti-aircraft artillery pieces, ranging from quad-barreled ZSU-23-4 Shilkas to massive 100mm flak guns. It was a wall of steel, explosives, and electromagnetic energy. Hours before the conventional strike packages of F-15s and F-16s crossed the border, a wave of 10 F-117 Nighthawks took off from King Khalid Air Base. They flew north under absolute radio silence. No lights, no emissions, no communication. They refueled in mid-air from KC-135 tankers in total darkness, a highly dangerous maneuver, and then pushed into hostile Iraqi airspace. Captain Greg Feast was flying the lead aircraft. His target was the Intercept Operations Center at Nukaib, a critical node in the Iraqi early warning grid. As he crossed the heavily fortified border, his radar warning receiver remained completely silent. The Iraqi radars were actively sweeping the sky, pumping massive amounts of electromagnetic energy into the atmosphere. But the radar waves were bouncing off the faceted angles of the Nighthawk and scattering harmlessly into the night. Feast was a ghost. At 2:51 a.m. local time, he approached the target. He acquired the concrete bunker on his infrared display. He designated the target with his laser. The weapon bay doors snapped open, exposing the aircraft for a few agonizing seconds. But the Iraqi radar operators saw absolutely nothing on their scopes. The 2,000-pound GBU-27 fell away. The doors snapped closed. Seconds later, the heavy steel warhead smashed through the roof of the bunker and detonated deep inside. The command center was completely obliterated. The Iraqi early warning grid was suddenly blind. Minutes later, the rest of the F-117 wave hit downtown Baghdad. The city was fully illuminated, completely unaware of the impending doom. The Nighthawks targeted the telecommunications center, the Ministry of Defense, and the presidential palace. They dropped their heavy, penetrating bombs with surgical, ruthless precision. The telecommunications building, affectionately known as the AT&T building by American planners, took a direct hit down its central elevator shaft, instantly severing Saddam Hussein's ability to communicate with his frontline commanders. The reaction on the ground was sheer, unadulterated panic. The Iraqi air defense commanders realized their most critical facilities were exploding all around them, but their radar screens showed empty skies. In desperation, they ordered every anti-aircraft gun in the city to fire blindly into the air. The night sky over Baghdad erupted into a terrifying, beautiful dome of red and green tracer fire. It was a scene highly reminiscent of the massive flak towers over Berlin in 1944. Back then, German gunners threw thousands of rounds of heavy artillery into the sky, hoping to hit the massive streams of American B-17 bombers passing overhead. But unlike the B-17 crews, who flew in tight, predictable formations and took horrific, bloody casualties from the shrapnel, the F-117 pilots were flying alone, miles above the tracer fire, completely untouched. The Iraqi gunners were throwing thousands of pounds of metal at shadows. By the time the sun came up on the first day of Desert Storm, the Iraqi command and control infrastructure was in ruins. The F-117 Nighthawk flew only 2% of the total combat sorties during the entire Gulf War. However, it struck over 40% of the strategic targets. Not a single F-117 was shot down. Not a single F-117 was even damaged by enemy fire. It was an unprecedented, flawless victory of technology over brute force. The wobbly goblin, the hopeless diamond, had proven its critics dead wrong. It had single-handedly rewritten the rulebook of modern aerial warfare. The Nighthawk had become the undisputed apex predator of the night, cloaked in an aura of utter invincibility. But arrogance is a dangerous vulnerability in military strategy, and what the Pentagon failed to realize was that the mathematical formula that made the jet invisible also contained a fatal flaw. A flaw that a clever, highly motivated air defense commander in the Balkans was about to exploit with deadly precision. That commander was Colonel Zoltan Dani of the Yugoslav Army, and the year was 1999. The United States and NATO had initiated Operation Allied Force, a massive air campaign designed to halt the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. American military planners, riding high on a decade of undisputed air supremacy since the Gulf War, had grown dangerously complacent. They viewed the F-117 Nighthawk not just as a low-observable aircraft, but as an invincible machine, wrapped in a magical cloak of invisibility. They fell into the deadliest trap in military strategy, which is the assumption that your enemy is static and incapable of learning. The United States Air Force was flying its stealth fighters out of Aviano Air Base in Italy, sending them over the Adriatic Sea and routing them into Serbian airspace, using the exact same flight paths at the exact same times, night after night. How does a massively underfunded, technologically inferior military force swat a billion-dollar American black project out of the sky? You do it by combining old-school human intelligence with a brilliant manipulation of electromagnetic physics. Colonel Danny commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 250th Air Defense Missile Brigade. He was equipped with the SA-3 Goa, known to the Soviets as the S-125 Never, a missile system that was designed in the 1960s. By all modern standards, it was obsolete junk. But Danny was a survivor, and he understood the fundamental limitations of American stealth technology. Stealth is not invisibility. It is simply a reduction in the detection range. An F-117 is designed to defeat high-frequency fire control radars, the X-band and Ku-band systems that guide missiles to their targets. The faceted angles of the Nighthawk scatter those short wavelengths beautifully. But Danny did not rely solely on high-frequency radar. He modified his early warning radar, an ancient Soviet P-18 spoon rest system, to operate on a very low frequency in the VHF band. Long-wave radar energy does not scatter off the flat panels of the F-117 in the same way. Instead, the long waves resonate with the physical dimensions of the aircraft itself, like a tuning fork vibrating to a specific pitch. It cannot give you a precise enough track to guide a missile, but it can tell you the general sector where a stealth fighter is hiding. Furthermore, Danny utilized a network of civilian spies stationed outside the fence line of Aviano Air Base. These spotters, with cheap cell phones, would call the Serbian command the moment an F-117 lifted off the runway. Knowing the exact takeoff time and analyzing the repetitive flight paths used by NATO planners, Danny knew exactly where the American jets would be and exactly when they would be there. He practiced extreme emission control, or EMCON. He kept his radars turned off to avoid attracting American AGM-88 HARM anti-radiation missiles. He moved his missile batteries constantly, tearing down and setting up in less than 90 minutes, playing a deadly shell game in the Serbian mud. On the night of March 27, 1999, the trap was fully set. An F-117 operating under the call sign Vega 31, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko, was returning from a bombing run over Belgrade. Because of bad weather, the EA-6B Prowler electronic warfare aircraft, which normally provided a blanket of radar jamming static to protect the strike packages, were grounded. Zelko was flying completely alone, unsupported and vulnerable. As Vega 31 approached Danny's kill zone, the Serbian commander briefly flashed his modified VHF radar. He saw the blurry, faint return of the stealth fighter. He waited until the aircraft was almost directly overhead, minimizing the distance the missile would have to travel. Then, Zelko opened his bomb bay doors to drop his ordnance. In that fatal 5-second window, the perfectly calculated geometry of the Nighthawk was compromised. The aircraft's radar cross-section bloomed massively on the Serbian scopes. Danny instantly switched on his high-frequency targeting radar, locked onto the massive radar return, and ripple-fired 2 SA-3 missiles. Zelko saw the brilliant flash of the rocket motors bursting through the undercast clouds. The first missile passed right over the canopy, buffeting the jet with its supersonic wake. The second missile detonated in a proximity burst directly off the left wing. The blast shredded the aircraft. The wobbly goblin instantly snapped into an uncontrollable, violent tumble. Pinned against his seat by massive G-forces, Zelko managed to pull the ejection handle and punch out into the freezing night. He would spend the next 8 hours hiding in a drainage ditch, evading Serbian search patrols with tracking dogs, before being miraculously rescued by an American combat search and rescue team flying MH-53 Pave-Low helicopters. But the damage to the American aura of invincibility was permanent. The burning wreckage of Vega 31, scattered across a muddy Serbian farm field, was broadcast on every television network on the planet. This catastrophic tactical failure mirrors a very specific, highly painful lesson from American military history. We have to look back to May 1st, 1960. The Central Intelligence Agency was flying the U-2 spy plane deep over the Soviet Union. The U-2 was unarmored and unarmed, relying entirely on its extreme cruising altitude of 70,000 feet to remain untouchable. American intelligence analysts arrogantly believed the Soviets did not possess a surface-to-air missile capable of reaching that high. Just like the planners in 1999, the CIA planners in 1960 grew complacent. They flew pilot Francis Gary Powers on a predictable straight-line route over Sverdlovsk. They underestimated the enemy's ability to adapt. The Soviets had secretly upgraded their SA-2 guideline missiles, and when Powers flew directly into their pre-planned engagement zone, they blew him out of the sky. The U-2 shootdown shattered the illusion of high-altitude invulnerability, just as the F-117 shootdown shattered the illusion of stealth invulnerability. Technology is only a temporary advantage, and hubris is always a fatal flaw. The strategic fallout from the loss of Vega 31 extended far beyond the borders of the Balkans. It triggered a geopolitical and industrial hemorrhage that the United States is still paying for today. The wreckage of the F-117 was not simply left to rust. Serbian authorities eagerly collected the shattered pieces of radar-absorbent material, the avionics, and the engine components. Intelligence operatives from the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China quickly arrived in Belgrade with briefcases full of cash. They bought the debris, shipped it back to their respective aerospace laboratories, and began reverse engineering the holy grail of American black projects. Are we to believe that it is a pure coincidence that within a decade of the F-117 shootdown, both China and Russia suddenly unveiled their own indigenous stealth fighter programs? The Chinese J-20 Mighty Dragon and the Russian Su-57 Felon owe a massive debt of gratitude to the complacency of NATO planners in 1999. By allowing the physical materials of the F-117 to fall into enemy hands, the United States handed its greatest adversaries a massive shortcut in materials science. This is a direct historical parallel to the end of the Second World War in the Pacific. In 1944, the United States deployed the B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced, heavily pressurized, radar-equipped bomber on Earth. During bombing raids against Japan, 3 battle-damaged B-29s were forced to make emergency landings in Vladivostok, deep inside the Soviet Union. Instead of returning the aircraft to their American allies, Joseph Stalin ordered his top aerospace engineer, Andrei Tupolev, to dismantle the bombers and copy them exactly, down to the last bolt and rivet. The result was the Tupolev Tu-4, a perfect Soviet clone of the American B-29, which instantly granted the Soviet Union a strategic nuclear delivery capability. Handing over the B-29 jump-started the Cold War bomber race, and handing over the F-117 wreckage jump-started the modern stealth arms race. Beyond the intelligence disaster, the United States Air Force was also facing a crushing logistical and economic reality regarding the F-117 fleet. The aircraft was simply too expensive and too fragile to maintain in a modern era of shrinking defense budgets. The radar-absorbent material, the RAM, was a nightmare. It was not a durable coating. It was essentially a highly toxic putty that had to be hand-applied, smoothed, and baked onto the aircraft. Every time a panel was opened for routine engine maintenance, the RAM had to be scraped off and reapplied. A single flight through a rainstorm could pit and degrade the coating, ruining the stealth profile and requiring hundreds of man-hours to repair. The cost per flight hour was astronomical. Furthermore, the aerodynamic compromises forced by the faceted design meant the aircraft was fundamentally limited. It was strictly subsonic. It could not dogfight. It carried a minuscule payload. As computer processing power exploded in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the physical theory of diffraction that birthed the hopeless diamond was no longer the only way to achieve stealth. Supercomputers could now calculate the radar cross-section of continuously curved surfaces. This led to the development of the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber and the F-22 Raptor air dominance fighter. These new aircraft did not need the jagged, flat panels of the Nighthawk. They used smooth, flowing aerodynamic lines that deflected radar energy while still allowing for supersonic flight and extreme maneuverability. More importantly, the aerospace industry developed radar-absorbent materials that were baked directly into the composite skin of the aircraft, rather than applied as a fragile external putty. The F-117 had successfully proven the concept, but the technology that created it had rapidly outgrown it. In 2008, the United States Air Force officially retired the F-117 Nighthawk. The fleet was flown back to the desolate Nevada desert, to the secretive Tonopah test range, where it was born. The wings were removed, and the fuselages were placed into climate-controlled storage. The era of the wobbly goblin was officially over. But in the world of black projects, nothing is ever truly dead. In recent years, aviation photographers and satellite imagery have captured unmistakable evidence of F-117s flying over the American Southwest. The Air Force has quietly admitted that a small number of Nighthawks have been reactivated. They are not dropping bombs. They are being used as aggressor aircraft, flying against American fighter pilots in training exercises. The F-117 is now playing the role of the enemy, simulating Chinese and Russian stealth platforms, helping to train the next generation of American aviators how to hunt and kill, the very technology that the Nighthawk itself pioneered. The F-117 Nighthawk changed the geometry of human conflict. It proved that a nation could reach out and strike the absolute center of an enemy's nervous system without sacrificing an armada of aircraft and hundreds of lives. It forced the entire world to rethink the concept of air defense, shifting the global focus from heavy anti-aircraft artillery to advanced multispectral sensor networks. It was a flawed, ugly, high-maintenance machine that demanded absolute perfection from the men who flew and fixed it. But on a dark night over Baghdad, it completely rewrote the rules of engagement. War is an unforgiving teacher, and the ultimate lesson of the Nighthawk is that no armor is impenetrable, no cloak is truly invisible, and the moment a military stops innovating, it starts losing. Now it is your turn to weigh in on the legacy of this black project. What do you believe was the most critical factor that led to the shootdown of the F-117 in 1999? A. The technological limitations of the faceted stealth design against low-frequency radar. B. The arrogance and predictability of American military planners flying repetitive routes. C. The brilliant tactical flexibility and human intelligence network of the Serbian Air Defense Forces. Let me know your choice and your reasoning down in the comments section below.